Hello, everyone, and welcome to this lecture on housing discrimination in the US. Now, before we begin this lecture, I would recommend you watch in the description below. I have two pre-lecture videos that'll give you an idea of the context of housing discrimination in the US. It's pretty important. And on this first slide here, I have it pretty comically put. The really easy way to solve housing discrimination is if you can't afford a house, go find richer parents. They'll pay for it. And that's really the theme of what we're going to cover today. But to begin, we're going to talk about the history of discrimination against blacks in America that really underpins housing discrimination. They really go hand in hand. And housing discrimination is very important. It's one of the largest forms of discrimination, and it's one of the most damaging economically. Now, as you might remember, there was a thing called slavery, which began a very long time ago in America. It actually predated the founding of our nation. In 1619, slavery came to North America. This was brought by the Portuguese and Spanish first, and then later by the French and the English to North America. And in this initial shipping of African slaves from Africa to America, to the Americas rather, 12.5 million were shipped at this time, and this is a large share. I think it's 3% of the world's population, something ridiculous like this. Of this 12.5 million that were shipped, only 10.7 landed and survived that trip. And this is really, really poor conditions because remember, the ship captains have an incentive because they're selling these slaves at a significant price. So they really should be incentivized to keep these slaves alive. At this time in England, for instance, you had ship captains that were shipping slaves to Australia, and they were provided money for each slave that lived and survived that trip. They had a survival rate, I believe, of 98%, 99%. There was a period of time, of course, where they weren't paid for the slaves or the prisoners that survived. And in that case, they had 20% survival rate. Here, though, at a comparable period with comparable technology, rather than having this 95% survival rate, the survival rate's less than 80%. So it was really just horrific conditions these slaves were shipped in at the time. Now, it took about 200 years, 250 years, 2 centuries for people in America to, well, come to the conclusion that slavery is immoral. And this was when Lincoln declared the Civil War. He declared all slaves free. And of course, the South rebelled against the Union in the North. And eventually, the North won. But that wasn't the end of the story of really essentially slavery, but we'll just call it discrimination for now, outright legal discrimination against blacks in America, because the Jim Crow laws were passed immediately after the Civil War, and these legalized segregation. That segregation that denied former slaves, denied blacks the ability to work in many areas, to live in many areas, to accrue wealth in many cases. Really horrific laws here. So, what resulted from the Civil War was that, well, really nothing changed for blacks in the South. 85% of former slaves that decided to stay in the South continued to do exactly what they were doing before, work on farms for very poor wages, work as sharecroppers now. So they weren't officially slaves, they were getting paid a wage, but they were getting paid a horrific wage that basically had them living in worse conditions than they lived in when they were slaves. Now, some slaves, many slaves, did flee the South because the South was horrifically racist at this time. About 60% of the slaves in the former South fled to the North. But these guys, these people, weren't given reparations. They weren't given any money or anything to make this trip. They were forced to move a long time, which even in the modern day is really, really tough to make this move from the South to the North. I've done it myself. Believe me, it's not too easy these days. But back in the 1800s, before you have like a car, it's unbelievably challenging. And these guys had no funds. They were slaves, right? They have no money whatsoever. So where do you move to? Where do you go as you flee the South with nothing to some city you've never heard of to the North? Well, you kind of go into these hovels. You go into low income areas in cities and you try and find work and try and make ends meet from there. But you know no one in this area, and really everyone kind of is still discriminatory. Even in the North, you still have many racists at this time. So where do you go if you're a black slave fleeing the South? You tend to cluster together with others in similar conditions, and this established many what you might call cities within cities in northern cities, places like Harlem or like West Baltimore, for instance. So all these blacks they settle in similar areas, And there's so many of them, and they all have nothing that really are hindering a particular area of the city, making it so there's a lot of people desperate for work in that area. And what's going to happen later on, well, in a few slides, actually, right now, is eventually what the city start doing is they start targeting these areas, saying these areas are a problem. Of course, they're a problem. You just let millions and millions of people flee the South with no real economic aid whatsoever and settle in this area. And no help was given whatsoever. In fact, the opposite was given here because, well, we had this period called the Great Depression following World War One in the 1930s here. And what happened to combat that was the Federal Housing Association was formed. And it was formed so that people could afford the ability to live in a home to provide cheap houses. And they did this by providing loans that were pretty advantageous, but only less than 2% rather of blacks were given these loans that were meant to help people get out of extreme poverty that came from depression, the Great Depression rather. So the blacks still weren't given any help at this point. So this is a long period of time where you have huge levels of economic inequity that are completely unaddressed. In fact, the opposite is given. The preference, the help is given to the poor whites over the poor blacks that are more desperate for it and really are more entitled for it. And these loans are, well, given as a result, partially due to the work of the blacks in these areas, the taxes that they pay on their income. And they're not given any real consideration or help from these taxes. In fact, their taxes increase as a result of this. Even worse, in the 1950s, after World War II, what happened were the veterans were compensated for their service by getting access to free or cheap, very cheap home loans, and we'll detail those in a few slides. So, very good home loan rates, 0% appreciation, were given to veterans to allow them to migrate into the suburbs. But these loans were denied to blacks. And we'll talk about the suburbs and how they were developing at this period of time, both in a few slides and in another slide deck. We have a full day lecture on suburbs and cities. So all these advantages that basically black citizens are entitled to, they're passed over for, completely passed over for. Ridiculous at this time. And you could say this is the end of discrimination, at least it's the end of segregation. In 1964, finally, these Jim Crow laws that legalize segregation are repealed, but there's no action at this time to reverse economic inequality that was established as a result of the segregation. The segregation being this separate but equal period in time where blacks were provided their own facilities that were much, much worse than whites at the time. And just led to really problematic conditions. And these are the things that we're going to detail all throughout the course. So just to give an idea of the time scale of this little period here, this is American history. We were founded in 1776, and just this year, in 2022, President Biden, was the first to acknowledge that there's a racial plight, that there was, well, centuries of economic inequality for blacks, and we should probably work to correct that in some way. Now, this thing here, this was how long slavery or direct legal discrimination existed, rather, in America. It's much larger, much longer than our country's history. So just to give an idea of the scale of how long slavery existed, and throughout this whole time where blacks were discriminated against, whites benefited from that discrimination. Remember, they got advantages from the taxes that blacks paid that blacks didn't get. They got tons and tons of free labor that enabled their families to become very wealthy. This wealth that still hasn't been recollected in the modern day. And they were provided basically the good land, first dibs of the good land. When the suburbs start to develop, when farmland becomes largely divvied up in American history, it's innumerable. The favoritism that whites were given in America, really the discrimination directed towards blacks in America. So our main topic for this lecture is housing discrimination. And to really describe that, we really need to talk about how and why having a house builds wealth. Today, you can think of it as when you own a house, you're paying a mortgage, you're paying back a loan that you have to yourself. So you're basically paying yourself rather than paying rent. Rents that already tend to be more expensive than a mortgage in comfortable living situations. And when you're paying back yourself, when you're paying off your own mortgage, this acts as a forced savings device. And forced savings is pretty nice. It's going to improve long term outcomes for you. There's a lot of his research that shows that. Further, a home's value usually appreciates much faster than inflation, so you're actually gaining money from owning a house over time. And the initial loans, what you would pay for a house when you're working out that paperwork with the bank, it's based on the value at the time of purchase, not at the value or the expected value when you do pay off the loan. So you're paying off a loan that's really lower than the home value will be over time. And these are for 30 or 15-year mortgages. We'll talk about the alternative in a bit here. Further, homes act as tax shelters or just equity towards loans. You get tax discounts on paying mortgage interests, and you also get it on paying home expenses. So if you're made a lot of money, if you made money to boost yourself up into the next income bracket, you can essentially avoid paying taxes on it by improving your home, using that money instead of just, I don't know, going out to the bar and drinking, building a deck or something like this. Further, the loan equity half of this is that you can borrow money against your home's value, you can remortgage, and you can invest that in the stock market if it's doing particularly well, and you can make even more on top of inflation. So there's all sorts of vectors to increase earnings by quite a bit when you own a house rather than have to rent a home. Now we're going to talk in more depth about redlining that we mentioned earlier. To buy a home initially depends on a loan. There's very, very, very few people that can buy a house that have enough savings to buy out of pocket. And really, you wouldn't want to. If you can get a loan, you should get that loan, and then you could invest the money that you have saved in the stock market and make even more money. But the people that could also do this, that could buy a house out of pocket, we don't really care about them in this course because they're ultra rich. They're pretty well off. We don't have to worry about them at all. In fact, we should probably tax them a little bit more. Now, loans often come from banks, but banks have to work hand in hand with local and state government. And well, when local and state governments or banks themselves are discriminatory, that's an issue. So Redline, it was the denial of the Federal Housing Association. Oh, sorry, there was also the Federal Housing Association at this time that gave a lot in loans to individuals to buy houses. It was still an institution set up during the Great Depression. So, anyways, Redline, it was the denial of the FHA to give loans to black neighborhoods that were marked on maps as red. When the FHA was formed, they kind of divvied up cities to decide who should we give loans to buy better houses, which areas should we prefer. And there were 3 or 4 jurisdictions. Business jurisdictions were given like blue or green highlights, and they were saying we want to prefer to buy houses in this area or give people that live in this area housing money or extra money because they're business owners. They're making a profit. They're contributing to the economy. And there was this red area on the map, which was supposed to highlight areas of concern, maybe areas of high crime, maybe areas of economic economic inferiority, people performing poorly, businesses not doing well in the area. But it really turned out that these areas were just where many, many blacks had moved to as they fled slavery. So these were the areas that were marked red on the map. And it was really easy to do so at the time because blacks were forced to basically co-locate in these areas. Now, there were some loans provided. As I mentioned, there was still less than 2% of loans offered to blacks, but these weren't great loans. These were what we call no equity loans. So if you missed a single payment on these loans, you didn't build any equity when you make that loan off. You just had a contract that said, if I pay off this loan without missing ever a single payment, then I pay it off. I own my house. Otherwise, I own nothing. So in this case, the no equity loan says if I miss a single payment, all the money I paid before then on the house, kaput, it's gone, worthless. So you lose it entirely. And these were prominent. Basically, all the loans that were provided at this time from the FHA or from the banks associated with FHA to blacks were these no equity loans. So worthless loans. Really, really easy to miss a housing payment, even if it's a mistake or the bank's closed or something. Do nothing to your fault or your detriment. It's going to come back and bite you in the ass. On top of this, these districts, these regions on the map that were drawn, the red areas were just passed over for upkeep. Huh, sorry, I thought I had details of that upkeep. Well, things in a city, things anywhere, they decay over time. Roads will develop potholes if overused. Buildings will fall apart if lived in or just really existing because, well, nature's a thing. And you have to maintain it. So you have to maintain water lines, you have to maintain schools, you have to maintain parks. And these areas that were marked on red were basically said to be economic risk areas where the city doesn't want to invest money. So they didn't invest money in the areas, and the areas got much, much worse. This is where things like using cheap substitutes of lead paint to paint houses came about, or other forms of environmental uh, discrimination, such that they damage the long term health of blacks in the area. They decrease lifespans here. So you had to use all these cheap alternatives because the government gave no money for improving areas in this place, and they didn't give out loans to buy new houses or build new buildings in the area, build new businesses even. And there are still modern forms of redlining. Redlining, to this extent, where basically regions of the map were marked as red, no longer happens. You do have equity, at least in the loans provided for blacks today from the federal government, but from banks, there's still a large degree of discrimination. There's these loans called 5-on-1 or 7-on-1 mortgages, and blacks are much more likely to be offered these loans. What these loans do is say, okay, I pay a fixed rate for 5 or 7 years, but then after that period of time, my mortgage payment's going to increase not from the pre-inflation rate, not from the purchase price of my home, but from the market rate on my home. And that increase is roughly 3 to 5 times the amount that people pay for those initial 5 to 7 years. And you'll have to pay at this increased market rate then until you pay off the market rate of the home rather than paying off the pre-adjusted market rate of the home before the home's value skyrockets as it does. And you'd have to pay off this much, much larger price. And well, that tends to bankrupt people because when people are offered these kinds of loans, they aren't often educated on the risks of these type of loans that you will have to pay a higher rate after the 5 to 7 years. They just look and see the 5 to 7 year loans, these options, which do offer lower initial payments. You do pay, I think it's 30% lower than the equivalent 15 or 30-year loans. But of course, you end up paying much more in the long run. So it's really easy to market these things, and you have deceptive marketing, which enables the purchasing of these loans. And they're also used as a tool to gentrify areas. I think I don't have an explicit topic here in this set of lectures, but I might cover it as a special topic later on. Gentrification is really driven through these loans because the banks give out these loans and they know which areas have these loans. So it's really easy for them to pressure an area by increasing the market rates, by buying out property there and forcing people to default on their loans and foreclose on the property. Because when they buy another property in the area, it increases the market rates and it increases the amount people with these 5-on-7, 5-on-1 and 7-on-1 loans have to pay. So this is redlining. In name, it's not continued today, but there is sort of an equivalent here in these 5-on-1 and 7-on-1 loans. Now there's a second degree of housing discrimination outright, which is the white flights. This occurred after World War II. I shouldn't put 1950s here. It was post World War II. Post World War II veterans, they were compensated for their service with loans, with preferential loans. These loans had a 0% APR, and they were offering much more money than was ordinary at the time. But but they were denied to black veterans. They were only given to white veterans. And white veterans used these loans to move into the developing suburbs. I mean, one of the benefits of the war was that personal transportation has advanced because they spent so much money developing engines and such for tanks and planes. So now you have like the personal automobile exists, so you can commute to work in a city, living in a suburb. Before then, suburbs were essentially farmland. But now the suburb full on exists, and we'll talk in its own lecture in Suburbs versus Cities on the advantages of living in a suburb versus a city, even if you own a house in both areas. So this lasted for a long time. These loans were set up for ages. You can even, I believe, still get these loans if you're the son of World War II veteran. I think there's some stipulation in there that you can get some money back partially. Anyways, even as blacks gained enough money at this time to move into the suburbs, they were restricted because the suburbs had developed racial covenants, which were just racist, just directly discriminatory. So the homeowners associations developed covenants that said basically you just can't outright sell your property to blacks. So they just couldn't move in. And these weren't, the Supreme Court tried this. They came to the Supreme Court several times that these things should be illegal, they should be unconstitutional, and they never outlawed it. The Supreme Court did not outlaw these HOAs. There's still some that exist in terms of homeowner association agreements. So there's still racial covenants today. They're not enforced. Probably if they were enforced, there would be a big issue, but they're still there. And at this time, they restricted mobility of blacks, and that hurt them in the long run. So the whites were able to leave the cities for the suburbs. But what happens with so much money, so much property tax leaving cities, those cities fell into disrepair because there's no longer a large support for the maintenance of the cities. And just as I mentioned in the previous slide, like redlined areas, the full cities now were falling into disrepair. So even where a black person at the time might work is going to be in worse condition than it was previously. On top of this, even once blacks were able to get around racial covenants and the like, they were harassed by the Ku Klux Klan, which had really widespread support at the time. So many blacks that were able to move into suburbs were the victims of cross burnings or lynches, in the case of like Emmett Till, for instance. And uh, basically, they just weren't allowed opportunity. And when you're not allowed an economic opportunity, it makes you much worse off. And well, we're going to spend a lot of the course detailing how blacks were made much worse off from this treatment. Now, this history, it's not just bad for blacks, it's bad for all people. Poor diversity in neighborhoods, it's going to be much worse for everyone. For I say both races as if there's just two. For everyone, low diversity is bad because, well, in economics, we have preference for variety. And if you have poor diversity, there's poor variety in the services available in an area, in your relationships available in an area. The biggest thing, the easiest way to motivate this is think about if you live in an area where they have one type of food only. You don't have any access to like Thai food or Mexican or Japanese or Chinese or anything like that. You're getting pretty damn sick of like that fried bar American food. And you're gonna really wish you had some other options, but if you have a whitewashed area, it's likely you don't. Don't know why I have this line second or twice. Now, the economic effects of this discrimination. As we showed in this the first lecture of this course, when sellers discriminate against blacks and they leave the market effectively, it's going to drive up prices in the area where the discriminated group is able to buy. So it's going to hurt them by basically making them charge higher price or pay higher prices and enable less to buy property, which is going to lead to overcrowding that has other detriments. And the figure here from 2012, at least, this is the most modern one I could find. I'm sure there's studies from the federal government now that Biden's finally moving forward with some form of reparations in Reconstruction. Pete Buttigieg's plan is meant to correct for a lot of this. Of course, it's going to be very minimal relative to what should be done, but at least to some degree they've addressed it. Anyways, the figure here from a Bayer et al. Paper in 2012 shows that blacks pay 4% more compared to whites for the same housing. So they're already just paying 4% more. If you're paying 4% more of a house, that is, what would that be? If you're paying for like a $200,000 house, or today now it's like 300,000 is the average house. You're paying an extra $12,000. That's over 20% of someone's salary. So you basically lose a fifth of a year minimum as a result of this, to put it in scale. On top of this, racial isolation is going to lead to a lack of development of tacit skills that are really important, or outright human capital to service one another in a community or industries. So to market yourself to industries. Where industry is going to move to, they're going to move to the wealthiest areas. So they're going to kind of develop tastes for similar skills that are shown in these wealthy areas, which are predominantly white at this time. Or, well, I'm thinking about like the 70s and 80s right now when I'm talking. But even in the modern era, you're going to see industries move towards very rich areas like California, Silicon Valley, and the like. Now, tacit skills are an important thing in economics. They're the skills that contribute to productivity, but are unquantifiable. Examples being communication, management, cultural knowledge, maybe knowledge of social contract, for instance. If you want to be like in the police force, you should probably know, okay, what do the police do? Like, how do they act in certain situations? We discussed this in a previous lecture, of course. Now, I want you to think about is, how have you seen evidence of the skill divide, racial or otherwise, in The Wire? So this tacit skill divide, how have you seen differences in this tacit skill expression in The Wire? I'll give you a second to think about it while I cough. Excuse me. Still getting over COVID, so these lectures are going to be of slightly poor quality of this period. Okay. So there's many instances of this. Just like communication is different in the two sides of Baltimore. The Barksdale crew, they talk very differently than the police do. And you wouldn't think that these people are any different. The police certainly aren't smarter than the people in West Baltimore. But they talk differently, they act differently, they act maybe more professionally, quote unquote, in one side versus the other. On the other side, in West Baltimore, you're acting professionally, but you're acting towards a different profession, right? You have to act in a certain way if you're in a gang to survive outright. And, well, that way of acting isn't going to get you a job on Wall Street, for instance, or like in a business firm as a salesman. Now, you should think about this on both sides, because what tacit skills do police lack that would make it so they're able to better serve black citizens in The Wire? And I just want you to think about this because there's many answers. I'm not going to provide an answer, but think about this to yourself. What skills are the police lacking? What tacit skills that are pretty important that would enable them to be better at policing the black areas shown in The Wire? And the second question here, what skills could advantage those in the drug game, in the business world? And you should really think about Stringer Bell. This character is kind of the prime example of it, how he's trying to develop those skills outright. But in these episodes that are associated with this lecture, he's kind of talking to his workers that really don't value these skills. They don't value the customer, for instance. And it's making this printing business that he runs that should be pretty lucrative. They should be making a lot of money from it, run poorer than it should. So the skills these guys lack because they grew up in gangs rather than in white suburbs is causing them to perform worse in business. And Stringer Bell's trying to bridge the gap here. So beyond just paying higher prices, you lose out on skills for both sides. Both sides of the coin lose out on skills as a result of this segregation in housing. Of course, blacks are much worse impacted. Now, the theme of The Wire, the first season at least, is the housing projects, and these were established. They're social welfare programs that are designed to give more money to low-income families, so that they are able to find some place to live and enable them to invest their time and money elsewhere than finding a place to live. So think about some pros and cons of housing projects as you've seen in The Wire so far. Give you like 10 seconds, you can pause the video here. I'm going to go to the pros and cons I have. So the pros here would be that you have more certainty in the future, which certainly relieves a burden for families in this area, and it keeps families together rather than forcing maybe mothers to leave their kids and not be able to take care of their kids because maybe a house that is available doesn't allow children, for instance, or just they want the kid to have a better life than they could provide if they didn't have the money to support them. And some cons here, it's leading to clusters of poverty, areas where you have a bunch of people in the same situation and that they're very poor, such that the skills that they learn, the behavior that they see, is problematic for people that want to earn money, that want to advance themselves. So there's a lot of monkey see, monkey do behavior here, and this is reflected in the school performances of people that live in housing projects versus people in the same school district that maybe live in a nicer house or a better home. You hear, oh, spoiler then. Later on, you'll hear Bunk talk about this to Omar. They went to the same school, but they came from different areas. So, not as a large spoiler. And then some cons here. These, at least in The Wire, they're reflected as controlled by criminals, but this isn't just seen in The Wire, it's seen in a lot of places because a lot of the people that basically show up as low income to the government are people that have income from other sources, illegal sources that aren't reported to the government. So prisoners tend to populate these areas quite readily. Of course, not all of them. There is some level of control, but it happens more often than not. Now, most research on housing projects, most economic research on housing projects says that they're good, but in media like The Wire, you don't really see the projects as being very positive. Uh, there are some aspects where the projects are positive in that it brings the community together, it gives them a common ground and a common place to congregate, and that's pretty important for growth of the community. But in other ways, it's seen as a heroin den where people are able to basically go buy drugs freely. You have other popular media. The Wire's from the early 2000s. It's pretty contemporary. There's media from like the 90s and the 80s, like Judge Dredd, that talks about they basically amplify the housing projects to say they're just massive, giant megaplexes. And in these megaplexes, you just have pure gang control of these buildings and drug trade. So that's the other extreme here. But at the time, they're depicted pretty poorly, housing projects. People don't like them. At least the people that it services don't like them. They think of it as a poor area, a corrupt area. Most economic research says it's good. However, we're going to challenge how that economic research is claiming that things are good in the housing projects. And we're going to use this paper by Steve Levitt, who is the author of Freakonomics, so you might know the name, and an anthropologist here that he worked with, Venkatesh, in 2001. And this just discusses sort of the norms of research in the paper in economics, the norms of research, and how these norms lead to missing small institutional details, details that really tell the individual story rather than the statistical average story, which economic research focuses on. So just as a background, in case you're not an economist or you don't know too much about economics, what economics research does is it tells you always the story about the average. What's the average impact of housing projects on child education attainment? What's the average impact on unemployment insurance, on the unemployment rates, for instance? It doesn't give you the minor details of maybe who's the 99% in that benefit or who's the 1%. And so you miss out on a lot of the in between, a lot of the things that could be improved are the minute, the fine details rather than the coarse details that the economics research primarily focuses on. So these large sample sizes kind of miss out on particular subgroups that should be focused on. The representativeness of research is often lacking because you have to look at people that are reported in data, and that doesn't represent all people. And it's going to cause them to miss specific subgroups that maybe the researcher is not knowledgeable on because, well, you tend to just work with data as an economist. You don't really think and look at people. So you miss out on all these important things. And to get around this paper at least, they do personal interviews in the housing projects for many years. The anthropologist does, at least. Stephen Levitt just helps them write the paper. But yeah, they do personal interviews. And this isn't saying that you should do this as opposed to economic research. Economic research is certainly valuable. It's just going to give you an average picture rather than a very important, in many cases, individual paper or small scale micro focused paper that you really want to look at if you're maybe in Baltimore making policies. You probably don't want to look at a paper that looks at how did these policies affect the whole of America, because the whole of America looks really, really different to some place like Baltimore. So this paper itself, they have some interesting conclusions. They find that there's very little differences in the description of the project's residents of kids that grow up to be, or kids that are currently gang members versus those that are working citizens. So there's no real difference seen in the description of these guys from other people in their community. They're basically the same type of person. So it's just different choices. Even in the probability of getting into trouble or causing some problem or being violent, the citizens in the projects, the housing projects that these guys interview, say, okay, the gang member kids look exactly identical to the citizens. There's really no difference there. They're the same type of people. Just one was incentivized to go into trading drugs or joining a gang, and the other maybe was choosing not to get involved. And both these groups, both gang members and citizens, children, that is, they in the project have far lower than average levels of education, despite there being really, really high returns to education in these areas. If you do get a high school degree, this is actually the best degree you can get it because it has the largest return to your wages. It increases your wages by the highest percentage. You might want to think about reasons for this. I had already gone over them in this lecture because I'm not talking to people, I'm just talking to myself, so I kind of go on a tangent. The reason, of course, is the monkey do, monkey, or monkey see, monkey do effect, where you grow up in an area, you see other people doing something, you're more likely to do that one thing. You're more likely to look at school as maybe a problem or something not to focus on rather than look at school and think of it as something really, really important to focus on as you might in a rich, wealthy suburb. Sorry, jumping through these things. So that's kind of the formal lecture here, and now we have a discussion topic. Of course, since this is an economics course, and we have our first economics lesson of Stringer Bell, where he's learning about the concept of elasticity. Unfortunately, the one lecturing to him, I don't know why they chose to have this portion of elasticity. They don't give a complete picture of elasticity. So they don't really describe what elasticity is. They just say, okay, if drugs are elastic, that means that if you change the price, if you increase the price, you're going to lose buyers. If drugs are inelastic, that means that if you increase the price, you're not going to lose buyers. So the question here is, are drugs elastic? So think about that. So let's first use the definition in the series, then we'll use the real definition of elasticity to evaluate this. So are drugs elastic here? And this is in terms of price. Price elasticity is what they were lecturing on. Well, later in the episode, they talk about quality elasticity. If you provide a low quality good, then you're going to lose buyers because they're not forced to buy from you. But if you provide a high quality good, they're going to be more likely to come back to you. So the answer in this definition is really no. You see that drugs are inelastic in this case because very often the people that, well, are buying the drugs are treated very poorly from the people selling it. And you even have Stringer Bell and Avon, what's the word for it? Colluding to reduce the quality of drugs and sell the same amount. They don't increase the price, they just dilute the drugs themselves. They give less purity in the drugs, so they're lower quality. People will still buy. Now, more formally, what factors affect elasticity? I have to give like a formal lecture on elasticity just because they butcher it in the show itself. It's the substitute. So for demand elasticity, price elasticity of demand, do your buyers leave? You increase the price. The main factor here is how easy is it to substitute this product for another? How easy is it to not buy a hamburger and buy some other good? For a hamburger, it's pretty easy, right? Because you have tons and tons and tons of other food alternatives. You can go buy hot dogs, you can go buy pizza, you can buy whatever else to substitute for the hamburger. So it's very elastic. But for a good like heroin, for instance, you get a very specific high. You can't really substitute that for anything else. So if you're addicted to drugs, that is. So it tends to be very inelastic, the demand for this. Now that's the elasticity for people that are already buying it. The elasticity for new customers potentially could be really, really high. It could be really elastic for new customers. If the price is too high or the quality is too poor, maybe they won't start doing drugs, and that's going to affect your long-term business. And there's many other things that affect elasticity, but substitutability is really the key. Every other factor that affects elasticity is through the substitutability. You also have a concept that's relevant here called the income elasticity of demand. Basically, how much does income affect your willingness to buy a good? And for drugs, income elasticity is really, really high because the people that will buy them, at least heroin, not like typical rich people drugs like cocaine, but for heroin, the income elasticity is really, really high because these people have very limited funds to buy them with. Now, thinking along this line of what are the substitutes to a good, what are the substitutes to drugs? Well, let's think about this. This should be, sorry, on two lines, this question. So what are the substitutes to the drugs the Barksdale sells? Well, there's many other places to get drugs. They haven't been shown yet. They'll be shown in later episodes of The Wire. There's many rival drug dealers. They mention them in season one, but they don't get into describing them. You'll see these other groups in season two and season three. So there are actually quite a bit of substitutes for the Barksdale's drugs. The people that buy drugs don't have to go there. They just tend to go there because it's walking distance from where they live. So it's just by random chance they go and buy these drugs over somewhere else. And these people are homeless, at least the ones depicted in The Wire, so they can migrate if they want to a different area to buy drugs from a different supplier. So in that degree, there's some extent of elasticity that you can't really overcharge the addicts. Maybe the Barksdale crew. Excuse the cough. Um, and the second thing, the Barksdale crews seem to have militant control over their area, so they have the influence elasticity there. Yes, they've deterred their rivals from selling in their area, in their sphere of influence, which does limit the elasticity. It lowers the elasticity. It makes more people willing to buy from them rather than anyone else. Now, an interesting example here is marijuana, which has been shown to be extremely elastic in both legal and illegal markets. So both these markets have to compete. If you don't go and buy medical marijuana, you actually will substitute quite readily the illegal good if the price of medical marijuana increases too much. Even people that have access, that have a medical marijuana card, will go buy from the cartels like in Mexico. They live in California, for instance. So there's quite a bit of elasticity here where both now the cartels are forced to limit their prices as well as medical marijuana companies. They have to compete in price with the cartel because they're a significant substitute for their good. Even recently, California has had to give tax subsidies to dispensaries so they can compete in price with the cartels. So drugs are a pretty elastic market because there's many, many places to get them because they're unregulated. You don't have to pay a lot of fixed costs to sell drugs. And that's the lecture here. Again, there's going to be pre-lecture videos for the next video we cover, and the next video we cover is going to be really related here. We're going to cover, rather than housing discrimination, full-blown discrimination by law in America. So discrimination de jure, or de jure discrimination as it's called. So I'll see you guys next time then.